Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm actually recording something completely different than the usual. No artist conversation or a book review. Today I'm talking to a Tantra teacher. And the reason I decided to do this talk is because it's part of the yoga teacher training that I'm leading. And it looks like we have someone already joining us. And I thought it'd be nice to give the students a little bit of background into Tantra. And also because when I started my yoga path, I didn't really know anything about Tantra. Looks like Peter's here. So today we have with us Peter Littlejohn. Hi, Peter.
Hello, Susie.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Great to have you. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Good to see you too. Yeah.
So Peter is or was a grunge drummer, turned into a therapist, and then a meditation teacher, and then into a Tantra teacher. And he's here to share with us basics about Tantra. Most of us here are relatively new, so please, the stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you. So there's many ways to approach this subject, but as the context is a yoga training, right? So that's that'll help to give a focus to what I'll share with you, because it's a vast subject, very multifaceted. I think a good place to start, because of the many different perspectives that there are on Tantra, and often very contradictory perspectives, contradictory things stated about it, believed about it. To begin with, contrasting a bit the modern perspective, let's say the popular idea of Tantra, with the ancient version of Tantra. And first, a kind of a comical way to frame it is, today when people speak of Tantra, often what comes to mind, especially if you've seen Tantra retreats, Tantra workshops advertised, or if you've seen things claiming to be Tantra advertised in the newspaper, classified. So the first thing that will come to mind is something relating to sexuality, maybe couples work, maybe erotic massage. Often quite a kind of glamorous image of sensual practices, intimacy related, and certainly you could say practices associated with the bedroom. And an ancient image of Tantra is more like somebody carrying a skull and perhaps sitting in a cremation ground, doing mysterious ceremonies. So that's a pretty big contrast. Maybe we'll have a bit of time to go into the big gap there is there between this ancient context of Tantra and the modern vision we have, the modern impression we have of what Tantra is about. But I'm going to really begin, at least. I'd like to also have time to answer any questions that come up. And if people want to send Susie questions, then there may be, I can answer them in real time. So this doesn't have to be like a presentation. It can be a communication, a conversation between us all. In trying to explain to people over the course of the last few years, with a few trainings and retreats and workshops, I've had the challenge of trying to define what is Tantra. And like I said, it is multifaceted. So what I've come up with is 4 core characteristics that are a kind of convergence of these multiple traditions. There's 4 key points which you can look at and say, okay, it's not all that defines Tantra. You know, you could go into much more detail than these 4 points, but these 4 points are universal to almost, if not all, the tantric traditions. So it's something that unifies them and can help us to understand as an overall definition. First of all, I'd say that the most important one is perhaps the objective of Tantra, which is spiritual liberation, self-realization. In the Indian tradition, usually referred to as moksha. In the Buddhist tradition, referred to as nirvana. And perhaps I've already spoiled this little joke that I sometimes play on people, which is to begin by saying, so who do you think is the most well-known, the most famous Tantra teacher? And people will usually say, Osho, because for many people, that's also where they come into contact with Tantra. It's through Osho or Osho's sannyasins and the workshops and trainings associated with Osho's work. And so I say, no, I think there's someone more famous than Osho who'd be the most famous Tantra teacher, and that would be the Dalai Lama. And people think, wait a minute, what, the Dalai Lama, Tantra? Because of course that association that popularly there is with the bedroom, sexual practices, couples practices. So they can't figure out, well, what's the Dalai Lama got to do with that? And of course, the Dalai Lama doesn't have anything to do with that at all, because that's not the context of ancient Tantra. And when I refer to self-realization, liberation, it's also the same goal that is the goal of yoga. You know, nowadays we can end up with the idea that Tantra is about the bedroom and yoga is about the gym. You know, that's the kind of the directions that these traditions have gone in the popular view of things. And really, the curious thing is that although there seems to be such a different idea of what these things are, yoga in the gym, Tantra in the bedroom, they actually come from the same source. And some of the things I'll say, rather than bringing clarification, they're going to bring up sort of questions and like, how is that possible? Like, what is, how so? And hopefully I'll be able to bring things into place, you know, so that some of the questions I'm bringing up will be answered as we go along. So the goal of both is spiritual liberation. And in the ancient terminology, this could be described as dissolving your karma, overcoming, in a more modern terminology, overcoming all the programming of our conditioning, experiencing liberation in the sense of being able to be truly free in this moment, rather than in this moment being pre-programmed by our past, both through our social conditioning as well as our biological conditioning, our predisposition to have certain physiologically defined needs, preoccupations, priorities, a liberation from conditioning on all these levels. So I'll go more or less quickly through these 4 core characteristics, and I'll go back into a little bit more detail on what each of these means, because obviously the subject of liberation could be really delved into in much more depth. But I'll leave it at that as an introduction. Liberation is the core objective of Tantra. A second core characteristic would be the honoring of the divine feminine. And this is a contrast that Tantra has to most of the perhaps more familiar spiritual traditions. Certainly in the, to kind of generalize, in the Western world, where we may be more familiar with Judeo-Christian, Islamic traditions, which tend to focus on the, let's say, the archetype of a masculinized, if that word exists, a masculine, a deity represented as in the masculine. Even though, certainly in ancient times, and still in the Islamic tradition, it is forbidden to represent God in any form at all, but it was still implicit that it is a masculine, in some sense, a masculine entity, God. Whereas in Tantra, what you find is not only an honoring of the feminine aspect of the divine as feminine, but also this influences, let's say, the path to the divine. One way in which it influences strongly the worldview, our relationship to life, our relationship to the divine, is that in a typically masculine representation of the divine, you also have a transcendentalist view of the divine, that the divine is beyond. The divine is kind of up there. The divine is beyond the senses, perhaps even beyond life. You know, perhaps it's in death you finally can experience communion with the divine, reunite with the divine. Implicitly, on earth, we're cut off. In the body, we're cut off. And in the senses, we're even more perhaps pulled down. This is often the way that spirituality is expressed within religion. And you see the consequences of that as being, when people are super devoted to the divine, they go off away from society to a monastery, a nunnery, into isolation, away from interaction, away from relationship, away from sensual involvement, away from sensual stimulation. In yogic practice and tantric practice, you have some practices that do involve a similar movement within, a movement away from the senses into, you could say, into a transcendentalist state, beyond the relationship with the world, as a part of the system, as a part of the process, as a part of awakening something that is usually dulled by our everyday activities. So the meditative process, the process of focus and withdrawing our attention from the sensory stimuli is a part of the yogic and tantric journey, but not in the way that I was describing just now, where, you know, the idealized proximity with the divine is you isolate, you go away from society. So it's part of the process to recover an aspect of ourself that is, you could say, beyond a veil of the usual state of consciousness. So what I'm describing now is still within this theme of the divine feminine being honored within Tantra. usually referred to as Shakti. Shakti can be understood as meaning power, divine power. It can be understood as meaning energy. So it is divine power, divine energy. It's the creative power. When you have a transcendentalist view of God, of the divine, the part of the consequence of that is perhaps you think of the universe as having been created by a divine will, a divine being in the past. You know, it was a divine event in the past. And we have stories that go with that idea that in the remote past, we were close to the divine. Stories such as the Garden of Eden, and we have versions of that story in different cultures where you've got this idea of a time when we were in communion, in proximity, in a naturally divine state, and then we got disconnected. Now, the reasons vary in the different stories, but there's this universal theme of we used to be in divine proximity and we got disconnected. In the transcendentalist perspective, and still I'm using this as a contrast to put into focus what is specifically tantric, because there's so much in common with other traditions, with all the spiritual traditions. So what's specifically tantric? The honoring of the divine feminine as creative power, not specifically as woman, but as creative power, gives us a, let's say, an opening into honoring Earth, honoring existence, manifest existence, the universe itself, our bodies, all of life. It gives us an opening into experiencing all of life as sacred, in contrast to experiencing life as a separation from the divine. In contrast to experiencing life as this period in which we are separated, and then at death, maybe we come back to the divine. The divine feminine as divine power, divine creativity, and also the power of manifestation itself. Let's say the power of not just the power of giving birth to the universe, but the form also of the universe. So the universe itself it's not just a result of divine power, but is a manifestation of divine power. It is the divine. In other words, we are surrounded by, embedded in, and are a manifestation of the divine power. Not just created beings, but manifestations of divine power. So that gives us an intimacy that is relatively absent in a transcendentalist perspective. It gives us an intimacy even through the body itself, through the breath. And Shakti can be seen in this kind of grand scale of cosmic power, but it can also be recognized within the life force, the life energies, prana Shakti. Prana, the life energies are a form of Shakti also. And yoga and Tantra work very much with the life force, the prana. So the fact that it is a Shakti honoring tradition in a way leads to the natural consequence of having this tool of spiritual practice, the prana. Again, I can come back into more detail on this second aspect. So the first, liberation; the second, the divine feminine as being honored within Tantra. And thirdly, Tantra is it is a nonconformist. The word tradition is actually a kind of contradiction here, of course, because the word tradition implies some kind of conformity to a system. But what characterizes Tantra is its nonconformity. It is its resistance to the traditional ways of being, of seeing things, the traditional rules, the traditional hierarchies. And so there is a context in which Tantra has appeared in different cultures. And that context has been repeatedly this resistance to the structures of power of that time, of that place, of that culture. So an example is that maybe it's more familiar to to many of you, the history of the Christian church, where until, was it the 17th century, 16th century perhaps, where the Bible was only available in Latin. So the receiving of biblical teachings was actually in Latin. In other words, many people didn't know what the teachings were. They went to a ritual in which the priest would speak in Latin, and certain things were expected of them in terms of ritual, but they didn't really have direct access to the spiritual teachings, only to a ritual and a hierarchy that represented proximity to the divine. And in a way, you had a similar dynamic in India, where the teachings and the rituals were performed in Sanskrit. And India is really a vast continent rather than a culture. It is a whole tapestry of cultures in which you have multiple languages, even multiple alphabets. So in many places, Sanskrit was certainly not what all the people spoke. And the rituals were, you could say, owned by the priest class, the Brahmins. And so what occurred was that you had what we could call enlightened teachers, awakened teachers, who dedicated themselves to sharing their insights, to sharing direct practices, teachings for awakening, for liberation with the people in their own language, and not just in terms literally of their own dialects, but in a common way of speaking. So some of the tantric teachings are in Sanskrit, but some of them are more like poetry, the poetry of the people, the common language of the people. Sometimes you could say the kind of the barroom language of the day, really the language of the common people, sometimes with layers of meaning, sort of mystical meanings embedded, that, let's say, a superficially clear or poetic meaning, and then layers and layers of mystical meanings embedded within, which was also a way of, in a way, revealing everything. And at the same time, keeping some things secret until they were ready to be unveiled. It was a revelation and a concealing at the same time. But there was this opposition to the hierarchies of the time. So not only is there this opposition in terms of bringing the teachings to the people, but what you find in many of the traditions is also direct opposition to the social norms, what people take on as, let's say, the comfortable ways of being, which involve the formalities of the culture and the taboos of the culture. And so Tantra would challenge what was formerly considered to be correct way of behaving, of living, and some traditions really took on the challenge head on of breaking taboos, making it really their system. Taboos would be ritually broken. So that's one of the contexts. I mentioned earlier that ancient image of the tantrika as someone sitting in the cremation grounds rather than practicing in the bedroom in a more glamorous context. This breaking of taboos is one reason why Tantra was practiced in the cremation grounds as a ritual associated with a place of uncleanliness, a place of fear, a place of death and decay. So this place which our instincts might say this is a dangerous place, and our let's say the social norms of the time would be also, if you're there, then you're unclean. And so it would be also a place where typically it would be the lower castes that had the work of being in the cremation grounds. But the tantrika would break these social rules. One of the rules also of tantric practice in terms of tantric community was specifically the breaking down of these barriers between castes, between the social divisions. Within the context of a tantric community, there was no social barriers, social division. This didn't mean that every tantric practitioner would outwardly adopt this way of behaving. In some cases, like I said, they would be really openly challenging the taboos, but in other cases, it was within the context of ritual, within the context of community practice, that these taboos were broken and these social barriers were forbidden. You could say that the social barriers were forbidden to be recognized. My cat's enjoying this this moment. I've sometimes presented this as three core characteristics, but I'll add this fourth, which you could argue that it fits into the nonconformity. The fourth that I'll mention is the impulse towards an egalitarian way of seeing things and of interacting and of living. Recognizing and defending equality. So, that makes sense in what I've just mentioned as an example of the social divisions. So there was a forbidding of, let's say, playing those social rules, of even recognizing those social divisions within the context of a tantric community, certainly within ritual practice. So that's part of this expression of the inherent vision of equality among all beings. And part of it plays out in the genders, in the way that the men were often given a kind of priority in some aspects of social life. And in the tantric tradition, there was this absence of hierarchy in terms of masculine, feminine, or other men and women. And you do find female teachers within the traditions. There's a lot that I could say on this, but I'll just in passing mention that in the Tibetan tradition, which for most people, what comes to mind perhaps when we speak of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is male monks. You may have heard of some female Tibetan monks, but perhaps what's more common for us to be more familiar with is the monasteries that are mainly male monks, lamas. there's a curious thing, which is of the main Buddhist, tantric Buddhist traditions, they trace them back to founders of those lineages, and they tend to refer to the founders as male. They go back to the male founder, but they, in the story, they speak of how that yogi, lama, saint actually learnt or practiced with a woman. In some cases, it's explicitly stated that they learnt from a woman, and yet they're seen as the founder, which is a little bit contradictory. If they learnt from a woman, then it would make sense to say that the lineage goes back to the woman rather than back to that man who learnt from a woman. This could be seen as an example of a kind of a concealed sort of patriarchal perspective where they don't recognize the woman as the founder. What could have happened, however, is that there was a tendency more in the male to create a system out of something that in the feminine approach was more fluid, more spontaneous, more, you could even say, natural, rather than systematized, regimented, and put into a form of rules, let's say, as a way of practice. So that might be why there's this kind of apparent ignoring of the feminine at the heart of it, at the source of it, because there was a shift in how the approach to Tantra was expressed, became more systematized, more mechanized, you could say, more mechanized through the masculine approach to it. And I just saw a question came up from one of the participants. Is there sacred masculine in Tantra? There is. In some tantric lineages, it is the Shakti that is really, you could say, the main representation of the divine, and they're called Shakta traditions, where it's really the divine feminine that is the representation of the, let's say, the idealized form of the divine that one is devoted to. But there are also Shaiva traditions in which it is Shiva that is the core figure, let's say, or representation of the divine in masculine form. And there are many stories of Shiva and his feminine counterpart or consort, and there are many names attributed not only to the feminine aspects, the Devi, but Shiva also has different names. So there's this recurring theme of the divine couple. There's also the representation of the two as one, in which you see in paintings and in statues, half of the figure is feminine and the other half is male. Half is the Shakti, and the other half is Shiva. So that helps us to realize it is not so much about there being two gods, because the word God has certain implications. It is two ways of representing the divine. I don't know if it's obvious how that makes quite a difference in our understanding. When we say Shiva is a god, and Kali or Parvati or any of the other forms, the representations, Durga is a goddess. It takes us into a way of thinking which can be misleading, because the tradition can be seen as monotheistic. It can also be seen as not theistic at all, which seems crazy if we're talking about beings that tend to be called, at least by Westerners, gods. That's the thing, you see, that often in looking at the ancient traditions, and especially these earth honoring traditions, which have multiple representations of the divine. It's not a coincidence that it's the earth honoring cultures that tend to have multiple representations of the divine, and the transcendentalist ones speak of a single, emphasize a single deity, because it's not that the earth-centric ones are necessarily polytheistic in the way that the religions interpreted it, the monotheistic religions interpreted it. They are honoring everything as the divine. They're honoring all qualities of existence. Everything, you could say, is a portal to the divine. Everything is divine power. And so it is represented in multiple ways. The word that it gets translated as God and Goddess is Deva and Devi. And one translation of that, rather than God or Goddess, would be radiant one, shining one, which implies not so much that it is the creator, and that's also the creator, which seems odd when we, tends to be what we mean when we use the word God, the absolute, the creator. So even the concept of multiple gods seems to be self-contradictory if we attribute that meaning to the word God. But if it means radiant, shining one, divine power in a way, then it's not necessarily a contradiction to say that it is this tradition or these set of traditions are, depending on how you look at it, it can be described as monotheistic, polytheistic, non-theistic, because of course Buddhism would be considered usually to be a non-theistic tradition. So that was a kind of a speedy approach to giving you an overview of these core characteristics. Liberation, I mentioned first of all. Secondly, the Shakti honoring aspect of the Tantric traditions. And thirdly, that it is non-conformist. And fourthly, egalitarian. It really seeks to honor the equality of all beings, the dignity and the divinity of all beings. And I could add something that is not always so evident, but it's more evident in the Buddhist tradition, where liberation is, at least in the Mahayana tradition, which is really what you find in the Tibetan Buddhist, the Tibetan Tantric tradition, you find that it is very explicitly stated that the purpose of liberation is not just our own liberation. The purpose of liberation is to be of greater service for the liberation of all beings. It is a path of service, of dedication to the relief of suffering of all beings, rather than just a personal practice for personal spiritual gain, you could say. And so just putting it in that context of the purpose of practice helps us to understand that it is motivated by compassion, by the desire to be a force of liberation within the world. And just that dedication, that motivation already kind of dissolves the contours of ego, because the moment that we say it's for us, it's about my development and my, let's say, level of development, my level of enlightenment, that all ends up being kind of you're supposedly working to dissolve the contours of your egoic thinking, your identifications, but you're also reinforcing them. Every time you think it's about your journey, about your development. So there is a key to the practice that's much more evident, perhaps, in the Buddhist approach, where it's emphasized that it is for the purpose of liberation of all beings.
That was a lovely summary.
Thank you.
I'm just curious if anyone has any questions right now. Anybody jump in?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Um,
And I totally welcome anyone to point out if anything I've said is contradictory to what you have learned elsewhere, because that can be also a rich point of deepening the conversation. It's like, oh, but I heard something different. You know, bring that up. You're welcome to challenge me on what I've shared, and see where we go from there.
you know, I had this, it just kept coming up that, so if we're honoring the feminine, then what happens to Shiva? And then
Yeah.
someone asked about the sacred masculine. So I was like, okay, we're all thinking on the same wavelength, but
Yeah.
Actually, in class, we are talking about how Tantra is the original yoga, which kind of got lost in translation, because when I did my yoga training initially, it was never part of the teachings that Tantra is the original yoga. Yeah. So if you want to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. That's one way that we can put that into context, let's say, is that there are specific traditions and texts that can be considered to be where the modern yoga tradition can be traced back to. And one of those lineages and texts associated with it would be the Nath tradition. And within the Nath tradition, or at least associated with it, you have the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. The more common text that comes up in yogic study, and I think even it's defined as being the necessary text along with the Bhagavad Gita, that in order to have the Yoga Alliance certification, there are these sort of, there's a framework of, you have to have X criteria in order to have your teacher training program certified. One of them is, I think you have to have X amount of hours dedicated to study of Bhagavad Gita and X amount of hours to the Yoga Sutras. Yeah, you're agreeing. That's, yeah.
Yeah, it's mostly the Yoga Sutras, which is kind of interesting that the Bhagavad Gita is not actually like a main requirement. I don't know if they're like moving towards that now, but so far it hasn't been.
Okay. And I might have looked at more than one of these certifying entities, and so perhaps it's Yoga Alliance doesn't require Bhagavad Gita to be studied, and maybe one of the others does, or it used to and changed. I'm not sure, but the Yoga Sutras has remarkably little to do with modern yoga practice. So it's funny. It's almost just kind of to give a sense of legitimizing the certification. Like you've studied the original teachings, but then you might ask yourself, okay, but what is it that the program has? What does it have to do? What does what we call yoga practice in modern times, what does it have to do with the Yoga Sutras? Very little, for the most part, because in many of the ancient texts, when they speak of asana, which for modern practitioners and in the idea people have of yoga in modern times, it's almost used as an equivalent term, asana and yoga. In the Yoga Sutras and in other of the ancient texts, you often find that the only reference to asana, the only description of asana is in the meaning of a sitting posture, a seated position, a stable position of basically suited to meditative practice, suited to the energy practices, the pranayama, suited to the stillness practices. It's one translation of asana is seat, and the implication is stability, stillness, and firmness. So the Yoga Sutras tend to have more that meaning attributed to asana. Other texts which are more relevant to the modern yoga tradition, which is so asana focused, are texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which have, like I said, they're associated with the Nath tradition, which goes back to Matsyendranath and Gorakshanath. And they are both attributed to, they're both considered to be founders of tantric traditions. So when it is said that yoga and tantra are related, or that they have a common source, you can trace them back specifically, for example, to Gorakshanath and Matsyendranath as founding teachers. But that's one lineage, mainly one set of lineages, you could say. And others would say that the source of yoga is Adi Yogi, the first yogi, referring to Shiva. I would say Shiva is the source of yoga, and some consider it to be a literal historical event, this incarnation of an enlightened being in very remote times, who taught the let's say the primordial yogic practices. And what you find in many of the tantric texts is that they are presented, they unfold as a conversation between Shiva and Shakti. They are a kind of question and response story, in a way, of Shiva responding to Shakti, or the other way around, Shakti responding to Shiva. And I mentioned earlier, you have the traditions that emphasize Shakti as the divine, and others that emphasize Shiva as the divine. And that plays out as who's the one answering, who's the one asking. And in these conversations, these expositions of the teachings on enlightenment, on liberation, it is yoga that is taught. You could say equally, it is tantra that is taught, because there isn't a clear distinction in those teachings. What is tantra? What is yoga? It's really one thing. You could call it tantric yoga. You could call it the practices of spiritual liberation. Yoga comes up as a description of the ultimate goal as well, as a name for the state of liberation, or of union with the divine, being fully united with the divine. Or one translation of yoga is to be yoked to, in the sense that like an ox has a, I think it's pronounced that way, yoke, that it's bound to. And so we are bound to the divine. That's one translation. One is united with, and the other is bound to the divine. There are many contradictions in when we study the history of Tantra, or we study certainly in modern times, when we study Tantra or yoga, you hear people saying Hatha Yoga is this, and Raja Yoga is this, and Kundalini Yoga is this, and you'll find that these terms, going back beyond a few generations and outside the specific lineages that are more associated with those terms have different meanings. Ashtanga is another example. Today when people say Ashtanga Yoga, they think of something that is a totally modern phenomenon, because Ashtanga Yoga is a term that would be more correctly attributed to the Yoga Sutras, and is a completely different thing in the Yoga Sutras to what Ashtanga Yoga became as a school in modern times.
There's another
question. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, Tantra is now very linked to the bedroom, but there is a lineage that is celibate in its practices. correct? Is the other one simply the one that reached us, or that was more successful in this part of the world?
Okay, yeah. So there is, to put it in, you could say oversimplifying, but it can help in the short time we have to frame it. There are two approaches that can be described as the left-hand path and the right-hand path. And typically the left-hand path is understood as being a path in which ritual practices with a partner are performed. The sexual union, the sexual ritual of divine union is a partner practice within the left-hand path. In the right-hand path, even though the same ritual is referred to by name, the Maituna ritual, it is interpreted as being an inner process rather than a ritual to perform with a partner. So what you have in the left-hand path is sometimes interpreted as being an option of practicing with a partner. In some cases, it's interpreted as being the highest practice, almost as a necessity. If you really want to practice fully, that it is a partner practice necessarily. That's one interpretation you find. And actually, even in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you find this sometimes, that it is considered to be the highest practice, advanced practice, the partner practice. So it comes up. But I want to mention that even in the traditions that do emphasize partner practice, they tend to also consider it to be, when they say it's advanced, it doesn't just mean it's better. It means you need preparation. That's also what's implied. It means it's not where you begin. It means that there is a lot of preparation, and it's also stated in some of the tantric texts, it's not a path for everyone. So it's not only, let's say, an advanced practice, but it is a practice only suitable for certain types of people. So and it's framed as being for the hero's path, as distinct to the path of what they refer to more as like the beast. And so they would consider in these texts that most of us are more beast than hero in terms of our personality or our relationship to our own senses and our own impulses. And while we have a more, to use that terminology, a more beastly relationship to our impulses, we are not suited to partner practices because we won't use them in the way they're intended. We'll make something else out of them. So that's, I began by saying the objective of Tantra is liberation. If our impulse, as soon as we have the opportunity to express sexual energy with someone and experience sexual intimacy with someone, if we're not absolutely clear on the objective of the practice, then the likelihood is that we go into instinctual expression of sexuality. It's very strong, the instinctive expression of sexuality. And so it comes up in the history of Tantra, this criticism from the right-hand path that the left-hand path has become totally lost in its objective. And you find often the Tantra being criticized culturally as being a sort of degenerate practice because it is, in modern times, there is a certain type of fascination with sex that is different in ancient times, but the impulse is still biologically tremendously strong. So even if sex played out differently in terms of how it was viewed socially, once sexual energy is activated, the tendency is for it to play out very instinctually. So yeah, in the right-hand path, it is taken more to be an inner process in which Shakti and Shiva are more focused on as a journey from the awakening of the divine energy, the divine power, Kundalini Shakti, from the, you could say, from the in a way, the bottom of the tree, from the roots of our energetic system, going all the way up to the crown, which is referred to as the abode of Shiva, the place of transcendence, going beyond form, beyond the, in a way, beyond the creation, you know, a place beyond the creation, beyond the diversification of the elements. So Shakti is within the realm of creation, and the tantric and the yogic journey in ancient Kundalini yoga or Kundalini Tantra is this awakening of Shakti and the clearing of the energy system through Shakti's movement through the body, through the energy bodies, reaching this union, this union, this blissful, ecstatic union with Shiva, which in a way is a description of liberation itself, this absolute union of Shakti and Shiva.
I have a question. Is Shakti used interchangeably with Kundalini? Or is that like a different reference?
It can be. Shakti is a more broad term to mean all of divine power, all of divine energy. And so Kundalini is a specific context of the manifestation of Shakti. And you could say the same about prana. Prana is a specific context of Shakti. Prana usually being attributed to mean vitality, life force, or even the air, you know, the life force in the air. But it's especially attributed to life energies. And Kundalini Shakti to the cosmic power, the divine power that is not yet fully awakened, not yet accessed, not it's been shut down in some sense, you know. The subject of Kundalini is one we could talk a little bit more about, if you like. It's really central to yoga, not just obviously Kundalini yoga, but to yoga, the yoga tradition, and to Tantra.
We could. We have been going on for about an hour now, so maybe a little more, and that's fine. We do have 2 modules on Kundalini, and we'll be going into more depth in a couple of weeks, so this will be great.
Okay, so a lot has been said within the texts, within the traditions, and in popular culture about Kundalini, to the point where it has become very mystified. And it has been, on the one hand, idealized as, you know, when you awaken Kundalini, you are one with the divine, you're absolutely enlightened, liberated. It's the, you know, supreme experience. It's sometimes put on a pedestal in that sense. And sometimes also implying that, you know, us mere mortals, we couldn't possibly have that experience, because it's this supreme liberation for the select few, very advanced practitioners, or the very evolved. And so it's sometimes equated with absolute liberation, the awakening of Kundalini, which relates a bit to what I was saying a moment ago, where the union of Shiva and Shakti can be used as a symbol for that absolute union with the divine. You could say that the yoga as with that meaning of union, or absolute bonding with the divine. But awakening Kundalini can also be, we can see it as being the beginning of a process, a shaking up of a waking up and a shaking up of a part of ourselves that was held down, that was repressed, that was perhaps completely unconscious. And that starts to come into awareness, starts to enliven, starts to come back to life. When it's seen as this mysterious and mystical thing, it tends to be very difficult to really explain it in a down-to-earth way. Like what does it mean and how does it work and all that. But if we look at it in terms of divine power, divine potential, divine energy, then if we look at the idea that the spiritual journey is not just a linear thing of becoming more spiritually evolved, spiritually advanced, but a dropping away of false beliefs, of attachments, dropping away of fear, a becoming intimate with the divine through this dropping away. And then if we think of Kundalini in that context, rather than that, you evolve to the point where Kundalini awakens, you drop away your fear and your resistances, your armoring, and then a naturalness, a richness, a fullness of being is experienced, and an aliveness. If we think of Kundalini in those terms, then it can be much more a palpable, let's say, an understanding that is within our language of experience rather than an idealization. In a line from the Christian tradition comes to mind where Jesus says something along the lines of, you can only enter the kingdom of heaven as a little child. It requires absolute innocence to enter into the presence of the divine, communion of the divine. If we think of the tantric tradition as being very much about that too, it is not just about sexual practices. It's not just about partner practices. It's about coming back to an absolute innocence and intimacy with the divine. That intimacy comes about through that innocence, through the falling away of the conceptual framework that is a barrier to experience. When our concepts become a filter through which we experience, we could even say through which we don't experience, through which we think about experiencing. And so the invitation of tantric practice and tantric philosophy is the coming back to our senses, but also the expansion of consciousness. You've got these two directions. Because when modern Tantra is presented as very sensual, coming to our senses, that's an aspect of it. It's coming out of your mental abstractions, that distance to the fullness of being that is the mental state, back into a richness of experience in the senses. But also, Tantra is not just that sensual, it is also the Shiva aspect. The sensual, you could say, is the Shakti. And the Shiva aspect is expansion of consciousness. And so Kundalini awakening, and this is also where the tantric ritual can be used for using the aliveness of the energy, the intensity of the aliveness of the energy to, you could say, to melt and dissolve all the resistances, the stuckness in the body, to awaken fully all of our being. And that is partly, you could say, a therapeutic process of working through where we are shut down and where tension, fears become somatized in the body. But it is also an expansion through and beyond the body, the physical. It is an expansion that continues, that doesn't stay with just the senses. The awakening of the senses is a portal through to infinity, let's say.
Wonderful. Yeah. So it's like a moving to wholeness. I like to think of it as individuation personally, and it can be painful.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's great that you brought that up. Yeah.
Glamour about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I'm really glad you brought that up, because often when I have people come to me for a workshop or a program training, I begin by saying, you may think of Tantra as this glamorous thing all about pleasure, but really for a safe tantric practice, you have to have a willingness to be facing fear, whatever's in your shadow, whatever is held down, has to be a willingness to for that to come into consciousness, for it to move, for light awareness to come there. And that is the effect of awakening Kundalini, let's say, awakening this energy, of allowing energy to move. Things come into awareness. And like you said, that can be, to say the least, uncomfortable. It can be blissful, but it's by no means guaranteed that it's all going to be blissful. The more we create a foundation of trust in life, trust in the life force, you could say trust in Shakti, and the veneration of the divine as Shakti helps to provide that foundation. You know, the religious aspect, let's say, of veneration has a gives us a powerful foundation for safe, smooth, and blissful practice. If we can, when all this tremendous transformation is taking place, if we can experience it as divine blessing rather than just, oh my God, what's happening? Rather than getting into resistance because of the unfamiliarity, if we can be opening to the unfamiliarity as a blessing, as an expression of intimacy with the divine, then we can go from fear into bliss through that trust.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I think it's probably a good time to start wrapping up. Seems like there are none. I'll give it a couple of seconds or more. Hopefully.
I really appreciate.
Oh, go ahead.
Go on. Just want to say I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you for those who have participated. I haven't seen you. Perhaps you're actually visible. I just didn't have you on my screen here. Now I can actually see you. So yeah, thank you for being here.
Lovely to have you. Hey, we've been planning this whole thing in Italy, and it just kept getting canceled. So maybe someday, I don't know. The space is still there waiting.
I hope so. It'll be lovely to have that experience teaching with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter. I guess we're gonna wrap.
Real pleasure.
And we'll see you another time. Take care.
Yes. Ciao. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.